been a recent study that's actually come out, and it's shown that people who have IBS have a lower quality of life than those people who've had a stroke.
Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm Jonathan, and I'm here to help you end 24/7 food thoughts, binge eating, and actually enjoy life with food. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only, not to be substituted for medical or personalized advice. Check the link in the description for my recovery resources, and let's get straight to the episode. In this episode, I'd like to introduce you guys to a special guest, Kirsten Jackson, the IBS dietitian. But enough about me talking about you, Kirsten. Why don't you tell us a bit more about yourself and what you do?
Hi, thank you so much for having me on the podcast today. As you already said, my name is Kirsten Jackson, and I'm a dietitian who specialises in irritable bowel syndrome. So I've been working in this area probably for about 10 years now, so almost all of my career. And basically how I first got interested in that area is I actually had IBS myself after being diagnosed initially with celiac, which I do have. My gut kind of never really went back to normal. And I just found that even though I was a registered dietitian at the time and trying all these evidence-based approaches, like things like a probiotic and in and out of the low FODMAP diet, that nothing really was working. And what I found was actually what we don't really kind of, I think, maybe concentrate on enough or understand is that even though the science is obviously very important, it's also how we do that and how we personalize that science to that person. So it's not so much just the what, but it's the how. And from that, I've got this method that I now use for people with IBS called the take control approach, which is all about taking control because, of course, we can't cure IBS, unfortunately. And it just looks at, nutrition, mental health, sleeping patterns, and then also movement so that we're able to, identify someone's problem and actually improve their gut as well. So that's what I do. I'm a UK registered dietitian, but I actually live out in Dubai. So all my clients are online and we do one-to-one clients. I have a group program as well. And we do things like ebooks. And I recently, excitedly, just got a book deal with Bloomsbury. So that will be out all about IBS and the take control approach next year.
Oh, that's amazing. And I know we just only opened this podcast, but since you already mentioned it, where can people find you if they want to access any of these resources?
Yeah, so either if you are a website person, on my website, it is thefoodtreatmentclinic.com. So the name doesn't have anything to do with IBS. So it's the name we had a long time ago, but everything is on there. So you can contact me if you've got IBS. There's lots of free articles on there and downloads as well, which is always very useful. Or you can actually go onto Instagram, and if you look up the IBS dietitian, then you can see all my posts on there. And again, you can message me on there if you're more of a social media type person.
That's perfect. And Kirsten, you mentioned with your story that you struggled with IBS and you've gone through a number of tests like celiac disease tests and other tests. So is there a specific diagnostic test to find IBS, or is it just rule out everything and see maybe it's IBS?
Yeah, so there is no one specific test for IBS. I think this is what makes people understandably quite frustrated because they feel as though it's the condition that you get diagnosed with once nothing else really fits. So they don't really feel like it's a proper condition. And actually there is, specific testing that essentially rules out other conditions. And once those are negative and you actually fit a very specific criteria for your symptoms, that's how you get diagnosed with IBS. So it's not like I've also got celiac disease, and with celiac disease, you would have a test for that. It would come back positive for celiac, and that's where you would get your diagnosis. So there is a lot of frustration from people who've got IBS, understandably, that they feel that it's not really taken very seriously for that reason. But be rest assured that there is a set process of how someone should be diagnosed with it. So it's not just a random condition. It really does exist.
Yeah. And that's really important that you mentioned that, because we have to go through a number of tests to find out if it might be IBS. But for those people who think they have IBS, or they might think they don't have IBS, because sometimes it could be played down that, okay, it's not a big issue, but what are the main symptoms of IBS, and what would you recommend once someone recognizes these symptoms, what should you do?
Yeah, so the symptoms I'm about to mention are the main symptoms and are the symptoms of IBS, but the severity will differ. So you might know a friend who's got IBS, or you might see a TV program with someone like IBS, and maybe it's a much more severe than yours or not as severe. And that doesn't mean that you don't have IBS. The severity really ranges depending on the person. But things like diarrhea, constipation, stomach pains, bloating, distension, which is the feeling of having your stomach pushed out as well, and also pain around that area in general. So all of those kinds of digestive symptoms. And what I would say is, if someone's having those, do not even waste a day, a week thinking, oh, it's probably IBS. It might be IBS, but it could also be a number of other conditions. So if you're experiencing any digestive problems, you really need to go to your doctor to have some further testing done. There's no way to diagnose you with anything without getting further testing to make sure it isn't something else.
Yeah. And actually, that really brings up a memory that one of my friends and another one, a loved one, she mentioned that sometimes she gets really, really bloated, and the doctors confirmed it was IBS, but she gets so bloated to some point where she would struggle to breathe or just struggle to walk up a hill. And it really is debilitating, if that's the right word. Do you think IBS can really affect people's quality of life?
Yes, it does impact their quality of life. And that's not just from my experience or seeing people how I think. It's actually been proven in research. There's been a recent study that's actually come out, and it's shown that people who have IBS have a lower quality of life than those people who've had a stroke. So we always think about having a stroke as we think about the stroke as, and it is been a very serious condition, life altering, etc. However, with IBS, we seem to think, it's not that serious. And actually, as you've pointed out there, it really does impact someone's life in varying ways. So yes, the quality of life, we know from research, black and white on research paper, it does really unfortunately reduce when IBS is uncontrolled.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it really affected your quality of life. And I think I couldn't remember. It's been like many years since I've heard the study. You could probably correct me on this, but there was a study that said when they asked participants if they would have 10 years of their life to be IBS symptom free, they said in an instant they would possibly have 10 years of their life just so they could have no more symptoms. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think sometimes, and this is my view in healthcare in general, if you think about it, but being healthy, if we think about health in general, it's not about just living longer and longer. If every day you're in pain, you've got anxiety that you can't enjoy to go out with your family, do the things that other people take for granted, then it's not really life anyway, is it? You're not really living. So yeah, I completely understand that people would, willingly give up a number of days of their actual life to be symptom free, because at the minute they're here, they're getting through a day, but they're not really living.
Yeah. Oh, that's really, really important. I really like that. Getting through a day, but they're not really living. So there's a difference between living long and actually living. And in this podcast, I actually go through supporting people with disordered eating habits, whether it's skipping meals, going on diets that are cutting out several food groups, or under eating. Do you think IBS has a role, or do you see clients who have disordered eating habits and it worsens or exacerbates their IBS symptoms?
Yeah, 100%. So I have never seen a client in 11 years who doesn't have some level of disordered eating.
Wow.
So, and I think we need to always think about eating disorders is obviously quite difficult to diagnose, because when we think about an eating disorder, we just think about bulimia or anorexia, which is, these diagnosed specific conditions. But actually, there's a lot of people in the spectrum of having more disordered eating. So disordered eating, which I'm sure you cover, you're the expert in this area in more detail. That could be, as you said, skipping meals, or it could be food aversion. So your anxiety around food, or avoiding whole food groups, not having other people cook for you, having certain calorie restrictions, things like this. And they are all part and parcel of irritable bowel syndrome. So it could well be that you're just really anxious and trying to control, your IBS in some way, or equally having these symptoms has made you have very little to no enjoyment in food. So you don't look forward to eating out, or you don't want to sit and explain at a dinner table why you have to eat a certain way. So you end up being secretive about how you're eating. It can make you feel very bad about how your body is. It doesn't really feel like your body. You're very bloated and you feel sluggish. And that can lead to, poor relationship with the body as well. And then we do see sometimes people who have got a history of anorexia nervosa, for instance, from previous. And even though they're somewhat recovered, there's still going to be those tendencies there. But because of that history of severe restriction, and sometimes getting down to very low body weight, even though their current calorie intake, let's say, is adequate to sustain their body and it's not considered, they're not losing weight, it's actually still not enough for their gut to move. And the problem is they may be prone very much to then constipation. So if they get told, by a doctor, maybe, oh, just eat more food or have more fiber, then even if they try to do this, they're going to end up feeling really bloated. But equally, we don't want them then trying to restrict on their own to try and resolve this. So it's a really difficult area, but very common area to navigate.
I can only imagine, like, even if you've gone through like pain or very, like, let's say you've eaten something or you started to eat more regularly, you might have like bouts of diarrhea, for example. It might cause you to also, it's like a chicken and egg scenario. Like you try to avoid food because of these symptoms, which could worsen the symptoms. But this might be a personal question, but do you think you struggled with any of like these habits when you struggle with IBS?
Yes, absolutely. So, and honestly, I think when you're working in gut health for so long, you don't have any boundaries anymore when you're talking about your own gut health. So sorry if this is too much information for people out there, but no, honestly, and even now, there's still certain, like, everything's under control, but it takes a long time. But previously, despite being always like a healthy weight, I would really not like my body. I'd try and work out probably more than what was healthy now on reflection. And I would be quite restrictive. So I'd often, go out and try do things like try and take longer to eat my main meal to keep me full because I thought that I shouldn't be having a dessert because I didn't need it. And then there'd be times where I'd like binge on things like ice cream. So very disordered, or try and just avoid all carbohydrates. And this is bearing in mind I was already, I knew that science behind, everything. So it just shows you, even when you know the logic, sometimes if your mental health is not great, that it's not that easy. It's just doing what you know you should be. You really do need support.
I'm so glad that you're much better, much in a better position where you are now. What steps did you take to be from where you were? You're talking about those difficult mental health habits and disordered eating habits to where you were now.
So very multifactorial, and I guess I could get on reflection, but on reflection, I probably could have got to where I am now a lot quicker had I have accessed help. So it's taken me a long time and it's still a work in progress. But the first thing I did for my mental health was I accessed a doctor. So I actually ended up on antidepressants, which don't necessarily resolve the situation, but they gave me some form of control rather than my mood swinging around. And then I was able to start doing some exercise, which was a lot more gentle rather than kind of vigorous. And then I looked at things like the low FODMAP diet, which I knew how to do as a dietitian, but in a very systematic way. So it wasn't just random food avoidances, not eating carbs or not eating, just getting a long restrictive list. It was very specific and for a short period of time. And then I was able to systematically reintroduce things. So I knew exactly what caused my problem rather than cutting out whole food groups, which is never needed. So that definitely helped. Just a combination of things. And I also went and worked with a therapist who sort of gave me some more of an accountable plan in terms of moving forward, with your mood and your mindset and things like that. So getting some professional help and then working through it systematically.
It's really good that thank you for being really honest and vulnerable, because it isn't easy, but hopefully these discussions and you raising awareness about mental health would really urge someone listening to just get some help. And one of your posts I saw on Instagram is that stress can be a really big contributor to IBS. How can being stressed really worsen IBS symptoms? It's not really a food really the thing. Would you want to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, stress. So stress impacts the gut hugely. So stress and how it does this is via something called the gut-brain axis. So this means the gut and the brain, they speak to each other. So this is through different communication pathways. So we've got nervous system that runs between the two. There's hormones going on as well, for instance. And basically, if you're stressed, if you're feeling down, even if you're excited and happy, that will impact your gut to some extent. But we also now know your gut will impact your brain as well. So this gut-brain axis, there's what we call bidirectional communication. So the brain speaks to the gut and the gut speaks to the brain. But there is something inside your body. It's a pathway called fight or flight. So what happens in fight or flight is if you were being attacked by an animal on the street, then your body would undergo a number of changes. So your heart would start pumping really quickly. You'd breathe quicker to be able to fight. So fight that animal off or run away from it. So that's an inbuilt system in everybody. But unfortunately, we in this day and age, our stresses are things like work stress or family problems, financial issues, things like this. So they are happening not just, now and again, they're happening multiple times a day. So that system is being triggered all the time. So your body is making these changes to deal with stress all day long. But unfortunately, one of the things in that pathway can it be that your gut gets very disrupted. So we know that people who go through chronic stress will feel things like chronic pain. So there might be nothing going on in your gut, but your brain will read that the stress is there. Your microbiome, so the bacteria in your gut, we've seen people who go through stress over multiple days, and microbiome, their gut bacteria starts to change. We know that people can have a disruption in the nervous system around the gut. So for some people, that can look like loose stool, so running to the toilet, having diarrhea. Other people, it could actually look like constipation. And as I said, the problem really isn't, if a wild animal is chasing you down the street, it's the fact that this is being triggered all day long, potentially. So stress has a huge impact on the gut. And what I've noticed with my clients is that when we go through some of their histories, they're very good at identifying, I had an exam that day, that was stressful, or perhaps they were in a car accident, or they had a big family argument. However, they're not very good at identifying the days where actually it's happening, the little things that are happening every day that are really impacting them. And that can build up over time. So a huge one that anyone with IBS needs to really address.
Are you familiar with the UK colorectal dietitian, Sophie Medlin?
Yes.
Yes, because I had a podcast with her recently, and she also opened up on gut health. It's so powerful, the gut-brain axis. Like she mentioned that 95% of your serotonin, the happy hormone, feel-good hormone, is all produced in your gut, and we're more gut bacteria than human, if that makes sense. So, and there's even more research popping up on gut health. So I think, as you mentioned, tackling that stress would be really helpful to manage your IBS symptoms.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Yeah. And it seemed like when you mentioned about antidepressants, did that have an effect, like probably a direct effect on your IBS symptoms?
Yeah, so I felt like it gave, I think, I don't want to go into too much details because I think that for everybody has different needs.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
What I would say to you is, regardless of what you need, because mental health is on the spectrum as well, some people just have a stressful day, other people need psychology input, medication, things. I think regardless of where you feel you are on that spectrum, you do need some input, whether that's that you can meditate on your own every day or you need, actual professional help. And what I would suggest is starting off with your GP, and then they can assess you and explain to you what your options are. And then from that, then you can kind of decide, what the best route is to go forward.
Yeah, very, very important. Always get help. By the way, just a quick break from the podcast to let you know of my free hunger regulation webinar series, which is in the link in the description of this podcast. There's also an ebook version if you're more of a reader than a watcher. This is the perfect resource I wish I had when I struggled with binge eating years ago, which is used to guide you from everything you need to know, from why we binge, what are the binge triggers, and the eating pattern to stop binge eating. Because when we've been struggling with binge eating for so long, you and your body lose touch of what normal hunger and normal fullness is. You're constantly on feast or famine mode. So head to the link in the description of this podcast for the free hunger regulation resources to have a clear game plan to tackle binge eating for good. Anyway, let's get straight back to the episode. So one of the most common questions I get is when people are struggling with disordered eating habits and they might have IBS or they do have IBS, it's not commonly the diarrhea or constipation, but most people complain of the bloating that happens before, throughout the day, or after their binges. Could you explain maybe some tips to reduce or prevent, or what to do after you feel bloated?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, because bloating is the one that comes up all the time with us. When I ask people what's the worst symptom, it's actually bloating, because it makes us feel uncomfortable, tired, not a great relationship with our body, etc. So bloating, we need to consider first of all what bloating is, and it's caused by excess gas in your gut. So that excess gas, we need to look at it in two ways. So we need to prevent it from happening. And then if you do have it, what can you do to actually improve it? So number one, what people can do to consider, preventing it coming in the first place is something like the low FODMAP diet process. Now, your listeners, if they do have binge eating disorder, it really depends on where they are in that kind of process, whether that's going to be appropriate or not. So when I'm about to explain this, the reason I'm saying it is because the last thing we want to do is, if someone has an uncontrolled eating disorder, is ask them to restrict more food. This will make the situation much worse. Okay. However, if you've recovered, then you might be in a place to actually speak with a dietitian, go through this process. And what the low FODMAP diet process is it is a diet where you reduce your intake of FODMAPs, which are fermentable carbohydrates that cause gases and bloating in some people. And you do this for a period of around 4 weeks. And then you systematically reintroduce them to find out which one it is. So that long term, to avoid, okay, so that food is going to cause a problem. So that's where you're coming to avoiding it in the first place. So that's one option for people who may be, a little bit further in their progress and process through this journey. And as I said, please do not do this if you are still in binge eating and purging and things like this. It will make the situation worse. And the last thing we want to do is further restriction. The other things that you can do, though, is just help that gas you are producing move along a little bit more. And the ways to do that are things like gentle exercise. So things like yoga, gentle walks. We're not thinking about negative calorie burns or anything like that, but just gentle movement to get the gas moving so that it's coming out in a more natural way, which should be little bits throughout the day. Whereas most of us, unfortunately, are sat at our desk all day, so maybe don't get that kind of stimulation to move through. Next thing is things like regular eating. So regular eating can be very, very useful, because if we don't eat, then our gut is not stimulated, so it doesn't move through. And that's where people can often suffer with constipation. And they don't realize, but constipation will cause bloating. But even if people who don't have any gut problems, if their bowels are not opening, they will produce a little bit of gas each time they eat. And if there's nowhere for that to go, they'll get bloated. So you do need to be eating, 3 times a day, plus snacks, depending on, how long you're going out for the day and things like that, if you're hungry. But if you're not, then you're missing out on opportunities to stimulate and move things through your gut. So eating regularly is another one. And then just taking your time to eat. So take your time to eat away from things like your phone, your computer desk. We're all guilty of it. Even myself sometimes, I know I shouldn't be doing it. But the reason is because if you sit on your phone at the TV, then often we can eat very quickly. And actually we're then bypassing the first point of our digestion, which is chewing. When we need to chew the food, and chewing the food, it mixes it with saliva, which mixes it with digestive enzymes. It breaks it down into a format that's then easier for our gut to then move down the system. So chew your food away from TV screen, things like that. Try some gentle exercise just to get your body moving. And then potentially looking at trying the low FODMAP process, depending on where you're at, and then just eating regularly.
Wow, that's a lot of amazing tips. Whilst we were going through all of them, I was saying yes, because all of the tips you mentioned, things as regular eating, trying to avoid cutting out complete food groups, gentle exercise, mindful eating whilst you're eating. Those are all the things that encompass binge eating recovery. It's all about those regular eating. And it seems like if you try to implement those, IBS/binge eating recovery tips, it improves all of the symptoms. So it's an all-in-one approach. That's so amazing. Yeah.
I'm not surprised. Some of those things, they seem very basic, but it comes back to actually it's probably going to be good for all of your health. So that's probably why there's a huge crossover there.
Yeah. And I just want to put a little disclaimer. If people are following a low FODMAP diet, not to try to follow it on their own, they need a supervision of a dietitian such as you, or qualified health professional with experience in FODMAP. Because what I found with some people who are following low FODMAP diets is, okay, I'm going to cut this out and then never eat it again for the rest of my life.
Yeah. And actually, when you look at the research around it, I'm always saying the low FODMAP diet is actually bad for your gut health. And people are very surprised because they don't get told this. They just think, oh, I've got IBS or I've got bloating. Low FODMAP diet's good for that. But actually, when you look at the research, low FODMAP, after 4 weeks, it actually reduces the levels of good gut bacteria. And of course it will, because actually FODMAPs are what we call prebiotics. So they're food for your gut bacteria. But that gut bacteria actually at the minute is creating maybe too much gas. So that's why you initially feel better. But at the same time, if you just remain on this diet, then your gut bacteria levels will reduce. So long-term, what we need is for you to only be avoiding the FODMAPs that cause you the problem, not the whole thing. And that's why it's a diet process, and it's only really a way to diagnose food intolerances. It's not good for your gut at all.
That's very, very important. Well, thank you, Kirsten, for just giving us all these tips about IBS and everything else. So once again, would you mind reminding us where we can find you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. And, to reach another audience, I know, often get left alone with the gut health side of things. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So in terms of reaching out, either thefoodtreatmentclinic.com, which is my website, which I said does contain a number of really good free resources as well. So have a look at that. And then also my Instagram, which is the.IBS dietitian.
That's amazing. And you said you have a program, Take Control program.
Take Control, yeah. So what I would say, if anyone's interested in that, Take Control, it looks at IBS specifically. But I would say if anyone does have a history of binge eating, what I would do instead is probably go into the contact page on my website where you can book a free inquiry call, because I'd probably need to assess them just to make sure they're at the right stage to kind of do that group program. Sometimes people need more of a one-to-one approach, and sometimes people are okay for group. There's never a one-size-fits-all, unfortunately, in healthcare. So definitely get that added level of care. Go to the website, go to the contact page, and then let's have a chat and see what's the best kind of solution going forward.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming along to this podcast. And I really appreciate you for just giving us all these amazing tips. And once again, if you want to find Kirsten Jackson, then just always head over to the foodtreatmentclinic.com and just find all of her resources over there, and make sure to follow her on Instagram and her other social media handles. So thank you so much, Kirsten.
Thank you for having me.
Struggling with binge eating? Gain access to my exclusive self-paced binge eating freedom course found in the link in the description of this podcast. My course is everything I wish I knew when I struggled with binge eating, but it's all wrapped up into one easy to understand platform. You'll finally learn how to put an end to binge eating and put an end to food dictating everything you do, controlling your life. Access it now in the link in the description of this podcast.